My favorite thing about Limelight, though, which doesn't get talked about enough, frankly, is that on certain nights when you went, there was a queer entrance and a straight entrance. And if
Wow.
you went in the straight entrance, you only got access to part of the club. Queer people could go everywhere. And the
Wow.
bouncers at the queer entrance, if they thought someone was trying to sneak their way in, would be like, I don't think you're gay. You two make out. Make out. Make out or I won't let you in.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Duke's Download. I'm your host, James Duke Mason. And today I am thrilled to welcome historian and author Hugh Ryan. Hugh is the award winning writer of books like When Brooklyn Was Queer and The Women's House of Detention, and his latest work, My Bad, a personal history of the queer 90s and beyond, is a funny, raw, and deeply insightful memoir that blends his personal coming of age story with the bigger cultural shifts of the 90s, from analog queer life to the dawn of the internet era. He is also the host of the podcast Queer 101 with Peppermint, who I love so much. I was telling Hugh that Peppermint actually starred in the musical that my mom's band, the Go-Go's, was involved with, Head Over Heels, about 8 years ago, and I love her. And I love the podcast, and so I love both of you, and I am just so grateful to you for being on the show, Hugh. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Duke. It is a real honor to be here. I am both a fan of yours and, of course, of your mother's. I saw Head Over Heels on Broadway, was wrapped. I have, although I will not run and go get it, a number of original vinyl from the
No way.
Go-Go's. So this is, a degree of separation of honor and an actual honor being here with you. So it's like twice over amazing to be here.
Oh, well, thank you. I was just telling you how I find the subject matter of your book. I mean, obviously, there's your personal story. I guess set against the backdrop of coming of age queer in the 1990s, but it also sort of functions as a history of how the decade transformed LGBTQ life. Obviously, you've done a lot in the queer history realm. You have a podcast. You've written various books. But what made you decide to turn the lens on your own experiences this time after writing like broader histories
You
previously?
know, it was a bunch of things. The half serious, half joking answer is that I like to eat and memoir sells well. I love queer history. It is a subject I am passionate about, but I also know that it's not something everyone wants to read, right? Densely footnoted, deeply researched history is something that I love, but in terms of sharing a story broadly, widely with an audience and getting it to the people who were there, and even more importantly, maybe the people who weren't there, I knew I had to look at this history through a very different lens, a personal lens, a lens that allowed me to be both a subject and a thinker about the subject, a lens that allowed me to be more alive on the page, more free, more fun, more accessible in every way. So that's one answer. The other answer is that I was having this really weird experience over the last, like, let's say 10 years of watching my teenage years, the 90s, repackaged as nostalgia, as film, as TV show, as book. Some of these projects were wonderful. Some of them were incredibly enjoyable. Some of them were terrible. But many of them, I felt like, sort of missed the heart of what my experience was and what the experience of so many people around me was. The queer characters in these productions, the young people, the people who were my age at that time, right, were often so knowing. They understood themselves perfectly. They had friends that they were easily able to come out to. They had accepting families. They had romantic partners. And they had, if there were problems with homophobia, it was covered in about 7 minutes and you got a happy bow at the end and everybody learned, right? And I just kept thinking, wow, that is bullshit. Like just absolute bullshit. People had those things, right? Some of us had some of them, some of us had others at different times and different places, but the clarity with which these characters experienced themselves and the world felt 180 from the experience I had growing up in an analog era where honestly, when I came out, had never met an out queer person. I
Wow.
had barely seen representations of real queer lives anywhere. And that was to me the essential experience that I needed to get down in writing.
Was How would you characterize that experience in one word? Would it be confusion? Would it be what would be the word to describe coming of age in the queer
Oh,
90s?
golly, that's a big question for one word. Can I be really like lame and pretentious about the
Yeah,
word? Because what I would
absolutely.
probably do is like you have to imagine it visually, textually. I know we're on a podcast, but like imagine you're typing it out and it would be parentheses and the letters im, and then the word possibility.
Mhm.
Because that combination of possibility and impossibility was so much of my life. I was told, three things about gay people basically before I met any. One, they were sort of a biblical abomination.
Mhm.
Two, they were also sort of a new invention that hadn't really existed until like maybe the 60s, but maybe also the 80s, who knows? And also, they were probably all dead because of AIDS. So queer people were both ancient, modern, and non existent. And this kind of like layered impossibility was so much of my experience. But
Mhm.
through that and in that, there was so much possibility because I didn't know what I was. I wasn't told what I was. I wasn't given any kind of guidance in many cases to experiencing and understanding myself, my community, my history, my future. I had to find that for myself through other queer people. And that was such an openness. I didn't recognize it at the time, right? At the time, I experienced it as confusion, like you said. I experienced it as uncertainty and excitement and fear and anticipation. But now, when I look back, it's one of the things I really see that in that lack of knowledge, there was the chance for those of us coming up to define ourselves and to find ourselves in ways where sometimes I think today, because of the pressures of social media and because of these layers of stories we're all receiving at all times, maybe it's a little harder to feel that kind of possibility. Also, as we were joking about before we started, it's the fucking apocalypse right now, so feeling any sense of a possibility is kind of hard.
That's a good point. It's right now for many it seems it's just about survival versus dreaming about the possibility.
Yeah, and that too. I mean, you're about to ask a question, and I'm so long-winded, I apologize. But
No,
what you're saying there
I love
about survival matters so much because I see so many young people today who grew up in a time, let's say post 2000, where HIV was a manageable condition,
it.
assimilation was everywhere. We were gaining marriage rights, and don't ask, don't tell was falling out of law. And they grew up in a time of expanding possibility. And now they live in a
Yep.
time where, like, a fascist government is trying to eradicate trans people, and from there, all queer people. And what I often want to say to them is, like, this is awful, but also we survived other awful things.
Mhm.
And if we forget that, we forget how to do it.
Well, no, it's true. I mean, I always say I feel really blessed that we am at that age where I'm both young enough to experience. I mean, although now, obviously, to your point, we're backtracking, but for a long time, it felt like, oh, well, I'm young enough to experience the benefits of this sort of burgeoning new gay rights, movement we've had the last 20 years, marriage rights and all that. I remember marching on the night that Don't Ask, Don't Tell got repealed, and in West Hollywood, and I mean, Prop 8, all of that. But also old enough to sort of witness the sort of it's at times difficult, but also at times very exciting. Like witnessing history firsthand and watching these big events take place. And kind of knowing sort of deep down, even though there were moments where you weren't sure how things were going to go, you kind of felt this forward momentum of like we're heading towards this the promised land,
Yeah.
but then again, after thinking in 2015, oh, we got there, I mean, granted we had a long way to go, but we got to marriage equality. I remember waking up that morning and thinking, wow, this feels like a big deal. But then that weird sort of thing of, well, but who would have thought that we always took it, a lot of people took it for granted that history progress goes in a you know goes forward in a straight line, and now we realize that that isn't necessarily true.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
scary, and it's kind of it's strange because, but then, as many have pointed out, American history in general tends to do that. Maybe we haven't seen it, we don't remember it because we weren't there the last time things like this happened. But with slavery and the Reconstruction, and then I don't know if you watched that series. Struck not struck by lightning, but about James Garfield when he was assassinated, and he
Yeah.
was he was pro Reconstruction, and he got assassinated, and his vice president was wanted to take us back to the pre-Reconstruction, and then we went through another
Hmm.
50 or 60 years until we had the Civil Rights Act and all that. So it's just people. I think people think sometimes that this stuff goes in a straightforward trajectory, when in fact that's not the way history mostly
No,
works.
not at all. Progress is never a straight line, and even the ideas of what makes progress are really complicated when you look back historically. For instance, I think marriage, same-sex marriage, is a great example, right? On the one hand, being banned from something that straight people can engage in is straight up discrimination, right? Like that's just, it's a very easy. Being
Yeah.
discriminated against, it's better when it's not there. On the other hand, marriage law as a way of distributing government benefits is a holdover from like the religious nature of so much of like Western European influenced culture. And is that a great system for attributing benefits? And does that support our country? And what does marriage law mean if you're in a relationship with three people, right? The ways in which we gain tolerance, we gain acceptance, we gain rights, and this is true for like all oppressed groups throughout time. It is a small and fractional process, right? It's you look at the last 20 years, you've got marriage rights, you've got don't ask, don't tell, but what you don't have is an employment non-discrimination act that's federal, right? We gain the right
Unbelievable.
to be more like straight people, but we don't gain the rights to be more like ourselves,
That's a really
at
good
first
point.
at least.
Yeah, and you're right. It's very odd to me I mean, I know that there was, I forgot the exact ruling, the name of the ruling, but I remember there was that ruling a few years ago that when Neil Gorsuch, ruled, and they kind of use that now as like, oh, well, technically, gays and transgender people are protected under whatever the law was, under the Supreme Court ruling. But the fact that there isn't a movement still to enshrine ENDA in under
Hmm.
law, a federal law, via legislation. The fact that that kind of just disappeared, I find very odd, because you never know. The Supreme Court, as we well know, could overturn, or I mean, just relying on them to give us any sort of protection, I think is a bad idea.
And this happens over and over again. The moment at which homosexuality was removed from the DSM, that's the diagnostic manual for psychiatrists, what they use to diagnose people with mental disorders. So homosexuality wasn't in it, then it was in it, then it was removed from it thanks to the works of all of these really important, like, queer activists, Barbara Giddings, Frank Kameny, all of their work causes it to be removed from the DSM. And in the very next edition of the DSM, they add gender identity disorder, which is another way of problematizing queer existence, right? We can look at that APA definition and say, okay, great, we got homosexuality taken out of the DSM. But the vast majority of people who were given that diagnosis, who were seen as psychologically damaged or problematized homosexuals, were folks whose gender identity was at odds with their bodies, with their experiences. The more femme or more butch you were, the more likely you were to be diagnosed. So when that diagnosis is taken out and replaced with gender identity disorder, in some ways what it does is it says, there's a sliver of people who do gender wrong, but it's just around who they desire to have sex with. And that is an acceptable way to do gender wrong. We're not even going to call that doing gender wrong. That's a whole different thing now called sexuality. But the rest of those freaks are still a problem.
Yep. No, 100%. It's incredible. I mean, and it seems as if obviously, to your point, we're going backwards the last few years anyway. Hopefully we'll see what happens in the next couple of years. But
Yeah.
returning to your book, I find that whole commentary so interesting, because it's also sort of a commentary on our broader culture, between the difference between analog, or the transition between analog to digital. And you talk a lot about that in the book, from mixtapes and club scenes as part of your sort of gay or LGBTQ queer discovery, to the early AOL chat rooms, which I remember from my teenage years. But like, how did that sort of transition play a role in your personal queer discovery? And how old were you when when you actually finally left your beginning,
Hmm.
your home, and moved to New York and sort of began to discover the the gay world for yourself?
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to take those two questions separately, and I'm probably going to forget the second one before I get there. So, starting with the
Okay.
first one,
Yeah.
how did this analog to digital change affect me? Well, I'll say this. When I was first learning about what it meant to be a queer person, my only options were to be defined from the outside. Like I love the Dire Straits song Money for Nothing because in the chorus they sing about what a faggot is. They were like, this little faggot, he's got an earring and makeup. This little faggot, that's his own hair. And I was like, okay, that's giving me some idea and being defined from the outside. Also, I love that the next line was that little faggot's got his own jet airplane. That little faggot, he's a millionaire. Like the pushback on that.
Yeah.
But so my ideas were coming from like mass culture, which was not made generally to be received by queer people and was not made generally by out queer people. So I'm getting defined from the outside. And whatever access I had to other ideas, like I went to the library and I looked up homosexuality in the card catalog, and all I found were college art textbooks talking about statues of Greco-Roman gods, right? That's how limited the information was that I could access. There were people dying of AIDS on the news, but they were vectors for disease. They were not
Right.
people. To
Right.
go to experience queer ideas, queer people, queer spaces, I had to physically go to them. And that meant a certain degree of freedom, right? I had to be able to leave my home. I had to travel. I had to have time. I had to have money. I had to have all of these things, which today many young people can experience that kind of like freedom of research, freedom of the mind to a degree through the internet and through cell
Yep.
phones. Of course, those things are not equally distributed. They are controlled in various ways, but certainly they had much more access to things than we did when I was a kid. And they also have much less reason to physically bring themselves to spaces where other queer people are.
Yeah,
So it's a
because even
really
the people,
different.
so it's not. So yeah,
Exactly.
there's both that they can find like gay movies or gay TV shows everywhere and gay, but then there's also gay apps and gay websites, and even within their own community, they'll realize perhaps that they're not alone, in
Yeah.
their community, that there's a gay person or queer person living, down the block in a way that
We live in
before.
two worlds at all times now. We live in the world we are in physically and in a digital world that is related to our physical world, but is one we build ourselves to some degree and connects us in all different ways. When I was younger, that simply wasn't true. You lived in your physical world and you had connections, right? We had cell phones, or we had phones and we had letters, but newspapers, movies, but you could not create the same level of this other community. And so we're constantly in two spaces, and that allows for all kinds of things and makes all kinds of other things hard, right? Because it feels like, as you said, we have access to like every movie in the whole wide world. But you look at what actually is streaming on Netflix, and like you go back before 1970, and they're like not showing anything. And I interviewed Sarah Schulman, who a brilliant, thinker and writer and queer community organizer, and she made this really great point to me where she was like, in the time period when I was younger, in the 80s, the 90s, experimental queer art had a huge audience because it was the only place where true things could be said about queer people. Now that there's all these kinds of entertainments that have queer people in them, some of them made by queer people ourselves with our own language and real struggles, it's much harder to get people in the room for something experimental because you have the option for the sort of like normative version. And that is a change that I lived through and experienced, and everyone of my generation and the ones slightly older than me and just slightly younger than me. I think you're a little younger than I am, but of analogous ages,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
went through that change. And that's huge.
Well,
That
I was on
changed
the board of
everything.
I was on the board of Outfest for 3 years, in LA. And look, I still love Outfest. I don't know if they even. I think maybe they recently have tried to bring it back as a in person festival. But I mean, there was a time, 2012 when I was on the board, 2013 when it was gigantic, and there were screenings all over town and massive gala events and massive celebrities that would show up for the event, and I think that and this doesn't just apply to media. This applies to sort of the gay rights movement in general. But we're a victim of our own success in many ways because it's become so sort of omnipresent in the broader culture. Gay people, trans people, queer people. There isn't as much of a need to have these independent films. Which when I first came out, right before I came out, I literally saw a Beautiful Thing,
Oh, I
and like
love that
saw it
movie.
on YouTube, and like found indie gay movies from the '90s, Trick, and all these movies on YouTube. and that was how I sort of discovered, these gay culture and yeah, and so it's a fascinating. I think our generation, my generation, are the last to experience that sort of pre-Glee era when when it wasn't fully like just where it wasn't everywhere you looked, in many ways.
It's part of everything. In order to have our share of the public, we had to give up some of the private that we had created before. I think about it this way. You asked about when I first came to New York City. So I grew up in the suburbs. My mom's from the Bronx. My dad is from Upper Manhattan, but I grew up entirely in Westchester. I went off to college at 18. I finally moved to New York right after September 11th. September 11th actually like made me move here. I had this immediate feeling of like, oh my God, I have to go home, even though I had never lived in New York City, but I had been raised as a New Yorker. My parents always said it is an accident that you are growing up in the suburbs. You are a New Yorker. That is not true, but I felt it. But when I came here, my first thing, in order to like find community and get involved, I went to the LGBT Center in Manhattan on 13th Street, and I volunteered as a graphic designer for their Valentine's Day dances because it was still a huge social center. And there were still many authors who were putting out queer books who could not get a book launch somewhere else. And so they did it at the center. And the center was a cultural and social center for a wide range of the queer community. Over the last 25 years, that's shifted and it's become, like many of our queer nonprofits, more of a social service agency providing services because for those people for whom just homophobia was the barrier to having a wider world of experiences, those people who are generally like male, white, cis, upper class, all of these things, were able to peel off, have those experiences elsewhere, and have dances, have bars, have book launches, have TV shows and movies. And in that way, our centers, just like our bars and our gayborhoods and our gay travel companies and our gay AA programs and our trans magazines, all of those have had a little bit of our focus taken away from them. And
Mhm.
that's necessary. I'm not saying it is good. I am not saying it is bad. Simply, that is the process of entering the mainstream. And I think we're experiencing this moment right now where we're all starting to wonder, like, okay, well, did we want to give away all of that, right? Like there was a rush to do it. I knew so many people in the early 2000s, queer people, wonderful people, friends who would be like, I don't understand all this separatism, like they'd make fun of 70s separatists or radical fairies and they'd never
Right.
think of going to a gay bookstore. But I'm like, yet every person you hang out with is gay. And every time you have brunch, it's at a gay restaurant in Hell's Kitchen. Like you are in
Yeah.
some senses separatist,
Yeah.
because there is something we
Harry
need.
Hay isn't that far away
Yeah.
in many ways.
And
Yeah.
I think many of us are now
I just came up with that.
reconsidering,
Why?
like, how much did we get? How much did we give? Where do we want to pull back? As a historian, one of the things I talk about a lot these days is for the last like 15 years, the gold standard for queer historical collections was get them into a university. A university will take care of them. Now we're seeing Don't Say Gay acts. We're
Yeah.
seeing laws that proclaim any examination of gender ideology is it's terrorism, and universities are cowing before these fascists. And as a part of that, these collections that we have spent so much time shepherding into straight institutions are now endangered. And many people are beginning to really think closely about like having our own organizations. I'm one of the lead historians of the American LGBTQ Museum. We're going to open in 2028. Originally, we weren't going to have a collection. Now we know we need to. Invisible Histories, who collects the histories of queer Southerners, originally was not going to have a collection. Now they are building a building, I believe, in Charleston, right? Like all of these organizations are really centering and focusing and asking these questions about like over the last 25 years, a major shift has happened. How much of it do we want to continue? How much of it do we want to sort of like question and retreat from?
Absolutely. And I've noticed that, there seems to be, even at least in LA, for instance, West Hollywood's still sort of a center, but it feels like people are more and more moving to go to like, more like the underground sort of events and parties, whether it be Ospenhof or Hot Dog or things that are, a little more. And there's actually a pretty significant queer and trans presence and intentional inclusion in these events. And I feel like that's something that you're right. 10 years ago, it felt like gays were like, look, don't get me wrong. I still love West Hollywood. I still love the Abbey and all that. But
Hmm.
it feels like that people are moving away from that and they're going for that more underground sort of community, more, queer community geared event versus this sort of like going to the places where, quite frankly, you're going to see like the bachelor parties and all that kind of thing. You know, like, and it seems like that people are making people don't want that. You know, even as happy as we are that it says, you know, heterosexual people and women and all that have
Hmm.
embraced us. You know, I do feel like maybe there's a desire to sort of have a taste of that, what it was
Yeah.
like back when we were a little more in our own realm, if that
Yeah,
makes
and
sense.
I agree, and it's a new version, it's a new thing, it's a post-digital thing, it's a post-cellular thing that takes from the old and imagines something new, right? Because it's roving queer parties. So the
Yeah.
party is a temporary autonomous zone, to quote Hakeem Bey, one of my favorite queer anarchist philosophers. It is a place that creates a space for a people in a moment, and that space can move locations, right? It doesn't need to be in one place. It's not the old neighborhood that you got to go to, but it
Right.
is a space you go to even as it moves around. By the same token, you no longer have to move to New York or San Francisco, but you get. I have a little fabulous queer cousin who is non-binary, trans feminine, a DJ, making an awesome life, career, and community in Richmond, Virginia, the same place where 25 years ago, I have two partners who've been together forever, and they were told they could not, in their bio for a show in a theater, write that they were boyfriends, right? That has dramatically changed. And that change is part of this same change. We no longer have these like dense spaces just in New York and San Francisco and isolated people here and there. We have some spaces in all different kinds of places. And some of those spaces are temporary and some of them you can return to again and again. It's a going back to the past, but mediated through our current lives and technology and making something entirely new, exciting, different. I think I can often come across as like a hater, that like the new world holds nothing for me, but absolutely there is so much possibility in who we are now and what we can do now that is amazing. And young people are the ones who are leading us forward. They are the ones who are only digitally native, who have grown up with the cell phone and know therefore how to like navigate it, whereas I find it like overwhelming and hateful.
No, it's true. There was a quote that I loved on your Instagram by it was I guess a blurb for your new book, but I thought it was so true and it speaks to your point about the youth. Hugh Ryan, as a queer historian and storyteller, knows that we're living in the present our past made possible, and so that's why I find it so uh, fantastic that you've made a career and sort of made an emphasis on preserving and telling the story of queer history because I'm big into history, not just in as a gay activist, but also just history in general. I'm into politics, and I think if more people knew history, we perhaps wouldn't be in the situation that
Whew.
we're in
Yeah.
today. Um, but I guess two final questions for you. Well, the first thing I wanted to ask you was about the pop-up Museum of Queer History, which is an amazing, amazing thing that I think you've done at a service for our community. But perhaps you could talk a little bit about that and how that came about and what the current status of that is today.
Absolutely. So back in 2010, there was this exhibit at the Smithsonian called Hide Seek. It was their first ever queer exhibit focusing on like queer topics. And a work of an artist that I love, David Wojnarowicz, was included in it. It was a video called A Fire in My Belly. And it had all of this stuff about AIDS and religion and gay identity in it. And it was protested and pulled from the show. Overnight, the Smithsonian caved. This right-wing website wrote this like terrible article about it. The Smithsonian pulled the video the next day without talking to the curators. Protests sparked all around the country, and suddenly A Fire in My Belly became like the easiest work of David Wojnarowicz's to see anywhere. I was living in New York, working as a journalist and a writer and a kind of like gadfly, and I was going to go down with some friends and protest the Smithsonian. When I had this realization where I was like, why am I going to protest the removal of one piece of like queer historical work in DC, where I'm never going to see the show if it weren't for this, when I can't see anything in New York? This is when Wima Perry had put out a review of like the major museums in New York City in the previous decades, and it shown that like none of them basically had done shows on queer topics ever. And I thought, wait a second. Instead of spending all my energy protesting this, which is important and good energy, I love a protest. what if I did something else? And I created a museum to sort of ask the question, like, what would it even mean for a museum to exist that was by queer people, about queer people, for queer people, in queer spaces, in places where we couldn't get kicked out for using the wrong bathroom or being too sexual or offending straight people. And so I started the Pop-Up Museum of Queer History just as a sort of like provocation. It was going to be a party that was also a museum, and I didn't know how it was going to do. I didn't know how people would respond. But within weeks, I had people volunteering. Buzz Slutsky, who's an artist and curator, volunteered. They were much more knowledgeable than I was about how to actually hang art and like make a museum space. Graham Bridgman, a development worker, helped do all of our fundraising. All of these people got involved. 30 people made exhibits. 300 people showed up that first night in my apartment, which, let me tell you, a New York City apartment does not fit 300 people. So at midnight, 12 plainclothes cops arrived to shut us down. That was a crazy little adventure, but it meant that we shut down before all the performances happened and before everyone got to see all the exhibits. And so the next day, everyone said, well, when's the next one? And how do I make an exhibit? And I thought it was just going to be,
Wow.
this little fun one night thing, but it steamrolled. And suddenly we were doing shows on local queer histories in Philly and in Indianapolis and in places all over the country, trying to ask
Amazing.
this questions like, what did people want from a museum? What did it mean to be a museum? What was our history? What wasn't our history? How did we share it? How did we make it into objects? How was it passed down? And it's an ongoing. I say we are on permanent temporary hiatus because one of the things we, the collective of folks who did the pop up, decided was that we didn't own this idea. We wrote an article for the journal called QED, which was all notes on how we did what we did because we wanted other people to take it. There are still other people ask me all the time about creating these kind of installations, and I am always excited. If anyone wants to do this, I am open to talking about it and sharing information. And that work really led me directly into writing my first book when Brooklyn was queer because we came back and we did a Brooklyn specific show after doing this general show and we learned we wanted to do really local histories. So then we did a Brooklyn one and nobody knew anything about queer Brooklyn history, we discovered. That's an exaggeration, but it was very different from the experience we had in Philly or Indianapolis, where so many people wanted to share these local histories. And so I began doing the research for myself to ask, like, why don't I know this history, right? What am I missing? That work led into my next book. That work led into my next book. All of this led into becoming the lead historian for the American LGBTQ Museum. My whole
Incredible.
career as a historian really starts from throwing like one gay ass party for a whole lot of gay people.
Well, and by the way, the American LGBTQ plus museum is going to be a massive. I mean, what an exciting project to be a part of. I mean, to be.
Oh, yeah.
I cannot
You're going to
wait.
have to come to our opening in
Oh,
2028.
I plan on it. I'm going to. I get, I'm on the list. I get mailers and, stuff on the updates and on the latest on the project. So I'm just so excited about it. I thought it would be a fitting final question to ask you because, I have friends who were there and I have friends who, are my producer, our mutual friend Josh. And I have a bunch of friends. I don't know if you know them, but people like Aaron Elvis and Candace Kane and people that were around
Yeah.
back in New York in the 90s and 2000s, early 2000s. But number one, what was New York City like and the queer culture at that moment? In a few words, how like if you could yet again, I know I'm into the few words exercise today, but like
Mm.
if you could sum it up, what was it like, and also what was the what how did music play a role
Mm.
in queer culture and in New York culture in the 2000s? Because I mean, music is still a big part of our culture, queer culture. But I feel like there's when I hear people talk about New York at that time, I don't know. There's just it's there are a few there are a few times in queer history that people talk about. And New York in the 90s and the 2000s, early 2000s, that was one of those periods that people always talk about as sort of being
Oh,
a
yeah.
magical moment.
Well, okay, so I'll say this first off. I was coming into the city as like a suburb kid, an upstate kid in the 90s. So my experience of it was different and very specific. But I would say it was dangerously fabulous. Dangerous in the sense that you could be harassed, you could experience violence very easily, so much violence, particularly if you looked queer. I was very gender nonconforming at the time. I was really exploring and figuring out for myself what did it mean to be queer or bi or trans. I wasn't sure of a lot of these things. And so there was a lot of danger. But also, it was a time where if you went to a drag show, you expected to be read by that queen. Like you were gonna get torn apart in the audience, and that was part of what you were there for, not for this like polished dance number, though you might get that too. So there was all kinds of dangers, and some of those dangers were exciting. Some of those dangers are what I went there for, right? And some of them were terrifying and were not at all what I wanted. And it was also fabulous in the sense that because there were so many barriers that kept us out of so many other spaces, when you were in our spaces, everyone was trying to do their most to be themselves, the most they could be, whatever that meant to them. And so, getting to your question about music, it was in queer clubs mostly that I began to see what you could be if you wanted to be a queer person who did not care about how the straight world judged you. You know, I saw the like fabulous club kids. I was touching the very end of that era, but like Mistress Formica and Julie Jules, and these people were still around when I was going out to Limelight and Tunnel and Twilo, and then later to Flamingo East and Esquilita and the Meow Mix and all of these bars that I remember going out to all the time. And they were fabulous little worlds. My favorite was Tunnel because I went to a party called Curfew, which was for young queer folks. Tunnel was 80,000 square feet in a former railroad like terminal. It had a room that was designed by the artist Kenny Scharf that had actual fake fur covering all the walls in a nightclub when people still smoked indoors. Can you imagine the smell of that room? I think it's still lodged inside my nostrils, honestly. But I also
That's
loved Limelight, which
amazing.
was like the most famous, queer
I mean,
club in a church.
of course, yeah.
My favorite thing about Limelight, though, which doesn't get talked about enough, frankly, is that on certain nights, when you went, there was a queer entrance and a straight entrance. And if
Wow.
you went in the straight entrance, you only got access to part of the club. Queer people could go everywhere. And the
Wow.
bouncers at the queer entrance, if they thought someone was trying to sneak their way in, would be like, I don't think you're gay. You two make out. Make out. Make out or I won't let you in. And
No
is that
way.
abusive? Is that wild? Is that something that would never happen today? Yes. Did I love it as a queer teenager? Absolutely. And
It's
those worlds were so important and they were fueled by music. The DJ, as the center of the club, the one who creates the space that we all sort of reverberate around, is a queer tradition that was really launched by two New Yorkers, Frankie Knuckles and Larry Levin, who created house and garage music. Frankie Knuckles DJed in Chicago at the Warehouse, where we get the term house from. Larry Levin at the Paradise Garage on the west side of Manhattan, where we get garage or the New Jersey sound from.
wow.
And those people, they got their start at the Continental Baths, the gay bathhouse where Bette Midler and Barry Manilow got their start, right? They created this queer nightlife experience, which now is just the nightlife
Well, I'll have
experience.
to. I had no idea about the warehouse and that's where all that. And so
Oh, yeah.
I'll have to do my research. I'll have to do my research.
Frankie Knuckles and Larry Levin, they transformed the
Wow.
world all of us dancing.
I'm literally writing their names down right now. It's fascinating. I mean, I knew obviously, I knew that dance music and house music sort of started in particularly in African American queer culture,
Yeah,
but
black, gay,
I didn't know
experience
that that was
DJs.
that there were literally two individuals that were sort of the main genesis of house music and garage music and all that. But anyway, I'm so grateful to you for being here and your book. I cannot wait to dive into it. My Bad, A Personal History of the Queer 90s and Beyond. It's right up my alley. And I'm so excited to read it. And I'm a huge fan of your podcast too. So,
Oh, thank you, Duke. This was so much fun. It is so great to get to talk about these things. I tell people this all the time, but like honestly, my work exists because of word of mouth, because of folks like you sharing these stories, being interested in them, and telling other folks about them. So this means everything. Thank you.
thank you, Hugh. See you
Have a
soon.
great
I'll see
day.
you in 2028 for the opening of the
Yes.
American LGBTQ Museum. I can't wait.
Excellent.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for this episode of Duke's Download. Please like, share, subscribe. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments or email us at questions@dukesdownload.com. Please check out Hugh's book, My Bad, A Personal History of the Queer 90s and Beyond. And feel free to look for his book on Bookshop, Amazon, or wherever you get your favorite books. Thanks so much, everybody. See you next week. Thank you for joining me today on Duke's Download. This podcast is part of Pride House Media, hosted by me, Duke Mason, and produced and edited by Josh Rosenzweig. Original music composed by Nell Balaban. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And while you're there, leave us a rating and review. It really helps others to discover the show. I'd love to stay connected with you, so join the conversation by following me at James Duke Mason on Instagram and X, or by emailing me at questions@dukesdownload.com.